Welcome to the Depth Dive. We've got a stack of sources in front of us covering a huge shift in the neuropsychiatric space, and our mission today is pretty simple. Cut through the clinical jargon and find the commercial truth.
Yeah, and the focus today is a major regulatory milestone. We're talking about the FDA approval of Caplyta, lumateperone, for major depressive disorder.
But not as a standalone treatment.
Exactly, as an adjunctive treatment. And this is a textbook case of a regulatory win, just completely resetting a company's total addressable market.
So we're going to dissect what this means for Johnson & Johnson, especially after their acquisition of Intracellular Therapies, Inc., and what really makes this drug different in, a very crowded field.
Right.
Okay, so let's start with a quick snapshot. What exactly happened?
On November 6, 2025, the FDA gave the green light. They approved Caplyta as an add-on therapy and adjunctive therapy to be used alongside standard antidepressants for adults with MDD.
And that adjunctive tag is everything here.
It's the key. This isn't just a new drug launch, it's an expansion. This is Caplyta's fourth indication. It's already approved for schizophrenia and for bipolar IN2 depression.
So when you add the absolutely massive MDD patient population on top of that,
you dramatically increase the revenue potential. It cements Caplyta as, a core asset for J&J's entire neuroscience portfolio.
Okay, to really get the commercial scale here, we need to talk about the clinical need. Why is the market for an add-on depression treatment so huge right now?
It really just comes down to the failure rate of current treatments. We're talking about, 22 million American adults with major depressive disorder?
A huge number.
A huge number. But here's the metric that matters for this deep dive. About 2 out of every 3 of those people still have residual symptoms.
Meaning they're standard SSRIs or SNRIs. They just aren't cutting it.
They aren't getting them all the way to remission. That 65% failure rate, that is a massive unmet need this drug is built to address.
So the addressable market for this kind of augmentation therapy is easily in the tens of millions.
Right.
But as you pointed out, there are other drugs here, other atypical antipsychotics like aripiprazole, quetiapine. They're already approved. So if you're a prescriber, why Caplyta? The answer has to be in the mechanism.
Absolutely. The whole story, the whole differentiator is in its mechanism of action. It's an atypical antipsychotic, sure, but it's often called a triple action modulator. It's hitting serotonin, dopamine, and glutamate pathways all at once.
Okay, let's try not to get lost in the biochemistry here. Can you just, break down the one thing that really matters? What makes it potentially safer than its rivals?
It's all about its receptor binding profile. It has a really potent effect on serotonin 5-HT2A receptors, which is good for mood and cognition. But the real finesse is at the dopamine D2 receptors.
Oh, okay.
It acts as a presynaptic partial agonist and a postsynaptic antagonist. What that basically means is it modulates dopamine without having to sort of blast the receptors with high occupancy.
And that high D2 occupancy, that's what gives you the nasty motor side effects, right? The restlessness, the akathisia you see in other drugs.
Precisely. And here's the part that built the commercial bull case. It has very low affinity for histamine and muscarinic receptors.
And those are the bad ones.
Those are the culprits. They're what caused the notorious weight gain, the metabolic syndrome, the sedation you see with older atypicals. If you can avoid those, you've got a game changer for a chronic illness.
That low metabolic liability is huge in depression. Patients might be on this for years. Poor tolerability means they just stop taking the drug.
Exactly. Adherence is everything.
Okay, so let's move from the theory of the mechanism to the hard data. What did the phase 3 trials actually show?
The efficacy data was strong. It was really consistent across 2 big phase 3 trials, Study 501 and 502. Both were in adults who had already failed their current antidepressant.
And they hit their primary endpoint.
They did. Both showed a statistically significant improvement on something called the MACRS total score.
Okay, before you throw out the numbers, for anyone who doesn't track psychiatric metrics daily, what is an MADRS score? What does a change in that score actually feel like for a patient?
Right, good question. MADRS is the Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale. It's the gold standard. A clinician rates 10 key symptoms: sadness, concentration, suicidal thoughts. The score goes from 0, meaning no depression, up to 60, maximum severity.
So a drop in the score is tangible relief.
It's tangible relief. We're talking about feeling better, functioning better.
So how much relief did Caplyta actually deliver?
In Study 501, patients saw a 4.9-point reduction compared to placebo. In the second study, 502, it was a 4.5-point reduction.
And in depression trials, that's a solid result.
It's a very robust result, an effect size of 0.61 and 0.56. A 4 to 5-point drop can be the difference between someone being severely impaired and actually being able to manage their daily life.
And what about speed? How quickly did it start working?
That was another key selling point. The separation from placebo was fast, as early as week 1 in the first study and week 2 in the second.
That's huge for a doctor treating someone in acute distress.
It's huge. That rapid action means patients feel better faster, and they're more likely to stick with the treatment.
What about longer term? What did the 6-month data show?
Even better, actually. The open-label extension study, that was study 503, showed really impressive durability. 80% of patients achieved a response.
And remission.
This is the headline number. 65% achieves full remission. That's a MADR score of 10 or less, getting 65% of this treatment-resistant group into remission. That is a massive commercial benchmark, assuming the safety profile holds.
Okay, let's talk about that safety profile. You mentioned the low metabolic liability was the theory. Did the clinical trial data back that up?
It absolutely did. The trial supported the hypothesis. Rates of weight gain, changes in lipids or glucose, and those motor side effects like akathisia, all reported as being similar to placebo.
Sexual side effects.
Also uncommon. I mean, on paper, for a drug someone might take for years, this is a winning safety profile.
It really does sound like the holy grail for a chronic med. But there's always a trade-off. If it avoids the metabolic problems, what's the catch? Is there another liability here?
That's the perfect question. I mean, the official box warnings still apply. They apply to the whole class of drugs.
Right, the increased mortality risk in elderly dementia patients and suicidal thoughts in younger patients.
Correct. But the real trade-offs we're seeing, they are coming from the clinical trials. They're starting to emerge from the real world.
And this is where it gets interesting for investors, the divergence between the clean trial data and the post-marketing data.
Exactly. We're talking about the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System, or FAIR Affairs, an analysis covering 4 years, from late 2019 to late 2023.
What did that real-world data expose?
It flagged 108 unanticipated adverse event signals, things the clinical trials didn't really capture. And the most prominent signal, the most concerning one, relates to a risk of manic switch.
Let's talk numbers. How big was that signal?
It was extremely high. We saw a reporting odds ratio, an RR, for mania of 73.82, and for hypomania, it was 34.74.
Whoa!
Yeah. It strongly suggests a risk of what's called a phase shift, pushing someone from depression into mania, even when it's just an add-on.
Okay, for listeners trying to wrap their heads around an ROR of 73, how do we interpret that? It doesn't mean 73% of patients become manic, right?
No, absolutely not. That's the essential context. An ROR measures how often an event is reported for this drug compared to how often it's reported for all other drugs in the system.
So it's a relative risk.
It's a massive statistical flag. It means the report rate for mania is 73 times higher than you'd expect. For a doctor, it means you have to be really careful to screen for underlying bipolar disorder before you prescribe.
And monitor closely in that first month.
Very closely.
Were there other serious signals that popped up?
Yes. Signals for things like serotonin syndrome with an ROR around 8.7 and urinary retention. But the most statistically alarming by far was the signal for pseudostroke. It had the highest RR of all at 122.6.
Wait, 122.6, that's a staggering signal. What does that practically mean, and how does J&J even begin to manage that risk?
It implies there might be some kind of vascular mechanism that needs a closer look. But you have to remember, these are spontaneous reports. They can be complex cases. But the data also gives us a clue on how to manage it. The time to onset.
Okay.
75% of these reported adverse events happened within the first month. The median onset time was just 13 days.
An early failure pattern.
Exactly. If a patient is going to have a bad reaction, it's very likely to happen in those first couple of weeks.
Which implies that intensive monitoring upfront is critical. That might slow down adoption a bit, but it also minimizes long-term risk if a patient gets through that window cleanly.
That's the entire risk management strategy in a nutshell.
Okay, let's pivot to the commercial runway. J&J needs massive penetration here. How is their market access?
It's robust. Caplyta already has insurance coverage for 93% of Americans. That's nearly all Medicare and Medicaid Part D, and about 90% of commercial insurance.
And they've been aggressive on pricing for the patient.
Very aggressive. They have patient affordability programs where an eligible commercially insured patient can pay as little as $0.
And there's a really brilliant piece of marketing built into that program for the MDD market.
Oh, it's genius. When a patient uses Caplyta as an add-on for MDD, The savings program also covers up to $100 for their generic antidepressant.
So they're subsidizing the entire regimen.
Right. They're making sure the cost of the base antidepressant, which the patient has to take anyway, doesn't become a barrier to starting Caplyta. It removes a key friction point.
Smart. Finally, let's talk about the long-term view. The FDA required a post-marketing commitment here. Why is the deadline for that so important?
The FDA required what's called PMC 4934-. It mandates J&J conduct a long-term randomized withdrawal study to confirm the risk-benefit balance over time. But it's the timeline that matters to investors.
What's the timeline?
Final trial completion is scheduled for October 2032. The final report is due in October 2033.
So this effectively sets a decade-plus non-generic runway for this indication.
It signals a decade of guaranteed exclusivity for this line extension. It's a huge commitment, but also a huge moat.
Which sets us up perfectly for our final segment. All right, this is the Deep Dive's Not Financial Advice segment. This is just a high-level strategic pitch, a thought exercise aimed at experienced investors leveraging the signals we've just discussed.
The whole thesis here really hinges on two things. First, that decade-plus commercial runway we just mentioned. And second, the clinically superior long-term metabolic safety profile compared to the existing competition.
That tolerability advantage creates sticky patients.
It creates sustained adherence, which creates sustained revenue in a massive chronic market.
So what's the outrageous but plausible trade idea?
I think you initiate a long-term pair trade. You go long on Johnson & Johnson or on the Caplyta asset itself, betting on that MDD expansion and the low metabolic side effect profile to just eat up market share.
And what do you pair that with?
You pair it with a short position on the stock of a competitor, a rival atypical antipsychotic that's also used adjunctively in MDD, but one that carries a well-known problematic liability for significant weight gain and metabolic syndrome.
So you're betting directly that the better tolerability will cannibalize the competition's sales.
Exactly. The thesis is that Caplyta's superior safety profile will actively displace those metabolically unfriendly drugs over the next few years. You're turning that clinical differentiation directly into financial alpha. It's a divergence trade based purely on competitive safety.
A very compelling analysis. So let's wrap this up. What's the final takeaway for the listener?
The FDA approval for Caplyta it's unlocked an enormous new market. This is driven by rapid efficacy and a really favorable long-term tolerability profile, at least in the clinical trials. This could reset what doctors expect from an adjunctive MDD treatment.
But the central tension, the thing to watch, is that gap between the clean clinical trial data
and the strong, unexpected adverse event signals from the real-world fears data.
Yeah.
Especially that very high RO-RAR for manic switch and pseudostroke.
So the final thought for you to mull over is this: how clinicians balance the need for that intensive 30-day monitoring for early failure against the undeniable decade-long metabolic advantage. That balancing act will define the speed of adoption and, ultimately, Caplyta's market dominance.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Caplyta approval. We'll definitely keep tracking this story as the market digests the news.